Today's podcast is supported by Winston Strawn LLP. Winston Strawn, a trusted legal advisor and advocate for clients across virtually every industry. Coercive Capital is proudly supported by Hummingbird. Hummingbird is a modern compliance platform designed to make financial crime investigations smarter, faster, and more effective. Because today's financial criminals are sophisticated, savvy, and agile, meaning the tools used to fight them should be too. Learn more at hummingbird.co. Welcome to Coercive Capital. I'm Elaine Dezensky. In 1977, the United States passed seminal and consequential anti-corruption legislation, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The FCPA fundamentally changed the way that companies, countries, and citizens view corruption by outlawing U.S. citizens and entities from bribing foreign government officials to benefit their business interests. But corruption in 1977 looked radically different than it does today. In the 70s, corruption was often viewed as a problem over there in other parts of the world. Many companies here in the United States consider corruption to be an economically productive way to address investment challenges in poor governance countries. But the FCPA had a tremendous impact, giving rise to a sea change within the private sector, giving birth to compliance departments, and awareness of the importance of transparency and mitigating risks from third-party agents. Despite some progress, however, corruption has continued to evolve. It has grown into something even more toxic, what has been described as strategic corruption, the weaponization of corruption by states to further geopolitical objectives. Corruption is no longer only over there, it's everywhere. Authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, Venezuela, North Korea, and Iran use their power to attack their neighbors and destabilize the global economy, allowing dictators and criminals to leverage our own systems against us, hiring lobbyists, lawyers, and corporate service agents to influence our elections, buy off our politicians, move dirty money, compromise our economy, and weaken our resilience. Simply put, corruption puts democracy in danger. Kleptocrats around the world are uniting to attack us, and the FCPA is no longer enough. New threats require new tools, like exposing the beneficial ownership behind anonymous shell companies, requiring financial gatekeepers, including financial advisors and real estate professionals, to conduct basic due diligence. With new Treasury regulations to bolster the Bank Secrecy Act, the passage of the Corporate Transparency Act, and the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act in recent years, we may be moving in the right direction, but more needs to be done. To help us understand the urgency of these new risks and tools, we will need to protect America, democracy, and maybe the world. I spoke with two experts and two of the smartest people I know on anti-corruption. Scott Greytak is the Director of Advocacy of the NGO Transparency International US, where he oversees its anti-corruption policy lab. Over the last few years, Scott has been recognized as one of the top lobbyists in DC, and I mean the good kind of lobbyist. Michel is the director of the Combating Kleptocracy program at the Human Rights Foundation. He's also written two illuminating books on the matter, American Kleptocracy, which examines American facilitators of illicit finance, and the recently published Foreign Agents, which shines a light on the dangerous influence of foreign actors in despotic regimes that undermine our democracy. Scott, I'm going to kick it off with you. The last 5 years, we've seen a remarkable increase in bipartisan anti-corruption legislation and on the regulation side. The Corporate Transparency Act, the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, new restrictions on the foreign influence, the so-called carte-en-riche rule, and the Biden administration's new FinCEN rules on real estate and investment advisors. It's early still, and the courts are still weighing in on the limits of the CTA in particular. But what do you think the impact of these laws will be in a decade or two?
Thanks, Elaine. I think it really is a moment in time for the United States. You mentioned the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That was largely an outgrowth of the Watergate scandal. Essentially, when investigators began digging into how the Nixon White House was able to get so much illegal campaign contributions, including from some major US corporations that were doing business overseas, they basically found in those corporate records that these employees of the US companies were giving huge bribes to both allies and adversaries overseas in order to grow their profits and arguably American influence. So it's funny that when scandals happen, anti-corruption reforms tend to come, we hope, as a consequence of those, as a silver lining. But the issues that we're talking about today weren't driven by scandals mostly, and certainly not by domestic scandals in the United States. They were instead, I think, brought together through a lot of hard work toward bringing together coalitions that maybe didn't realize that these issues were important to their portfolios. So the hard nuts and bolts shoe leather of having conversations across the political aisle, across interest groups and constituencies, that's a big part of it. But I think it's also understanding that as the United States and its allies' geopolitical role is being threatened to maintain and to grow their influence, not only in their own countries, but in third-party developing countries, often around the world, then this can give the United States and its democratic allies a much larger global strategic advantage. And I think that that also helps explain a lot of the cross-partisan support for the reforms that you've mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think FIPA, the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, is really the next FCPA in terms of its impact? Or are we looking at something that is more limited in terms of how it impacts the playing field?
I would say, I would call the question for any American criminal law that has greater potential than FIPA. I don't know of any American criminal law that has the potential scope and list of future indictees and defendants as this law. Most American criminal laws apply to the 340 million or so Americans in the United States. FIPA, or the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, gives the US Department of Justice the power to go after any official, any employee, any state-owned entity in the entire world that asks for or receives a bribe from an American company, from any company listed on American Stock Exchange like the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. We are talking about a law, and given the prevalence of corruption around the world, my company, Transparency International, does an annual survey of perceptions of corruption. Those results show that 2/3 of countries in the world are dealing with serious levels of corruption. The potential pool of criminal actors here is massive, and that authority is so broad. I challenge folks to think of a broader US law, especially one that carries, 15 years of imprisonment and significant fines like the FIPA. So I think it has a potential game changer. It comes down to political will, right? We've heard from our chapters all around the world that they need this. Our chapter in Venezuela talks about how their high-level prosecutors can't go after senior-level officials, only low-level corruption, because that would upset the regime there. Our chapters in Africa tell us a similar story. The Middle East and Lebanon, our chapter who supported this, told a similar story. So we know that the world needs this. We know that the United States has the capacity. The folks who will be implementing this are the very same folks who enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act at the DOJ. They have the experience. They have about 50 attorneys who work on these. It really comes down to political will and prioritization, and I will certainly be doing what we can from our end to keep close eyes on that and oversight to make sure that they use this law as much as they can, and we don't go, as we did with the FCPA, decades without actually bringing enforcement actions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We have an opportunity now with FIPA to set, I think, a bit of a new standard around enforcement, how we use these tools, how we work with allies and partners to make sure that these laws are as impactful as they need to be. What do you think are the most important steps that the government, DOJ in particular, should take to make sure that they're off on the right footing when it comes to FIPA prosecutions and enforcement?
Casey, I saw you with an idea. Did you want to jump in there?
No, look, I just wanted to hop in briefly to echo everything that Scott has obviously been saying, not only on the bipartisan side, so many of these solutions, FIPA included, coming from a place of bipartisan support. But Scott, as you just alluded to, when the FCPA was first introduced in 1977, and Elaine, as you mentioned, being an extremely progressive, pro-transparency, pro-business piece of legislation that placed the United States of America as the very clear leader in this broader anti-corruption, anti-transnational corruption space. That is all perfectly true, and we have seen the success of the FCPA, not only on the prosecutorial side, but also on the kind of imitation side of other governments implementing their own versions of it. But as Scott mentioned a moment ago, it was a long time, it was decades before we saw real, true enforcement for what the FCPA actually was and how the FCPA could live up to its potential. Now, of course, that pattern of a piece of legislation, a piece of regulatory reform being introduced and then being effectively forgotten, or at least certainly unused for years, if not decades, that is a theme in the United States of America's historic approach. Of course, Elaine, you and I spoke just the other day about things like the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which we might talk about later, which was on the books for decades without any kind of real enforcement. I'm just echoing what Scott mentioned a moment ago, that we do have the expertise for FIPA. We do have the political will for FIPA. And thankfully, we have folks like Scott on the ground willing to keep folks' feet to the fire to make sure it is actually enforced, because we cannot afford to wait decades, with the FCPA nearly 30 years, before we saw the real true enforcement of what was a game changer of a piece of legislation, just as FIPA is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for jumping in there. Maybe I'll ask you both then to comment on, what do you see next in terms of the pipeline for potential legislation and regulation, both aspirational ideas that might need to build over time, or ideas, for example, the enablers legislation, which has been discussed for a while now, that could, with some additional support, move from idea into law.
Yeah, Elaine, I think you said it. I mean, the Enablers Act is still the highest on the must do for the United States. The main financial transparency and accountability organization in the world, the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, put out a review of countries this summer and how they regulate their enablers. These are lawyers, accountants, financial service providers, wealth managers, registered agents, these intermediaries that are essential for criminals, including corrupt officials, when they want to move and hide their money overseas, often into the United States. These are the go-to service providers for these criminal networks. They do not have to ask, if a company client walks into their office, who's actually behind that company. They don't have to do any due diligence to say if the owners of that company are under indictment for corruption in a foreign country or otherwise. They don't have to flag any suspicious transactions or financial activity that client may ask them to do. And it has been identified for decades now as the biggest loophole in the United States anti-money laundering and anti-corruption framework. So just this summer, the FATF put the United States at dead last, tied, I believe, with China in our ability to regulate these enablers of corruption. So this law came within one key vote of being adopted in 2022, with a large shot in the arm, an important boost because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how so many Russian oligarchs were hiding their assets in the United States by using these enablers. We think that in 2025, we've got a real opportunity to take the huge and deep bipartisan coalition that supported it last time around and finally get it over the top. So that is certainly going to be the top priority, I believe, for the anti-corruption community next year.
And I'll flag, to pick up everything that Scott just said, out of the executive branch as well, there are a broad array, a broad constellation of potential solutions and improvements for whichever administration comes in after the November election. We've already seen in the past few months executive action or executive rulemaking apparatus directed at finalizing the rules and requirements for some of these enablers that Scott just mentioned a moment ago, including most especially real estate agents and those involved in real estate closings, as well as the private investment sector, the private equity, hedge fund, and venture capital sectors. Both of those sectors have enjoyed effectively decades-long exemptions from very basic anti-money laundering requirements, those that things like American banks have been subject to for years and years, ever since the early 2000s and the passage of the Patriot Act and the anti-money laundering provisions therein. We have known about the role of the American real estate sector. We have known about the role of the American private investment sector for years, if not decades at this point. Scott just mentioned Russian oligarchs and other proxies for the Kremlin. That is but one example of many, whether it is out of China, Iran, Venezuela, you name it. If there is a malign kleptocratic regime, the odds are extremely good that they have used and abused the American real estate and or private investment sector to their benefit. And thankfully, we have within the writ of the executive branch the ability to form these new rules as it pertains to basic anti-money laundering requirements, basic due diligence, so that that loophole, that decades-long loophole, can finally be closed, and these industries can stop acting as a sponge for so much illicit wealth from around the world.
Just to pick up on that, so these rules are going to be going into effect next year, which is a huge positive development. Think about how those who were in Vladimir Putin's orbit and helped keep his regime in power. Oleg Deripaska reportedly owns a mansion down the street from me in Washington, D.C. that was able to be acquired through a U.S. shell company. Roman Abramovich, another Russian oligarch, was able to move $1 billion into the United States through an investment advisory firm in New York State. This is how these regimes stay in power. And the fact that these rules are now going to be on the books, as Casey said, cuts off two really important channels of illicit finance and support for corrupt regimes. I'll also just say, just so folks get a sense of how genuinely bipartisan these reforms have been, the Corporate Transparency Act, as Elaine, you mentioned, sets up the first beneficial ownership database in the United States. It requires companies to report their true owners, a certain subset of companies in the United States that are high risk for money laundering. This was supported from everybody from ExxonMobil to Friends of the Earth, right, to the Fraternal Order of Police and the NAACP, to Representative Carolyn Maloney, former representative from New York State, who was also impeaching and doing the impeachment activities against President Trump, whose Treasury administration supported the Corporate Transparency Act. About as broad as you could get. The Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Greenpeace, and a whole host of folks in between. The Enablers Act, supported by everybody from the Republican Study Committee to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Laura Ingraham, to over 80 labor, social justice, racial justice, and environmental organizations, a who's who of progressive political support. So we're going to maintain that coalition. We believe that these issues hit a real sweet spot and moment of opportunity in the otherwise very polarized political environment we're living in. But just to give some details on that, these are genuinely bipartisan. It is just a matter of making them a priority and harnessing the political will for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is progress that 10 years ago we would have thought would be impossible to achieve. And I do think, part of this is the convergence of the more traditional aspects of going after, the corruption challenge with this overlay of national and economic security and making the connections between how rogue regimes are influencing America's democracy and other democracies, using tools, using strategic corruption in new ways, exploiting these loopholes that we've known about for forever, really, but haven't taken the real action to close. So I think it's this combination of the interconnected nature of these threats, but also the ability to really look at ourselves and the systems. You mentioned the U.S. ranking rather low on one part of the FATF review, and we should really be taking that to heart because it is within our power to change this dynamic. And it will be an amazing shift to have, this combination of enablers legislation plus beneficial ownership plus FIPA that is truly, truly game changing.
Yeah. Elaine, if I could just hop in, I think what you mentioned a moment ago, that 10 years ago, we would, of course, not be having these conversations, let alone be anywhere nearly as optimistic as we should be. I think it's easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day minutia of the news cycle, of even some legislative or prosecutorial failures in this space, and think to ourselves that we're not making nearly as much progress as we should be. In a certain sense, that's right. There's still far more work to be done. But if you broaden the scope just a little bit, even limiting to the last 8 or 10 years, the progress has been absolutely remarkable. I mean, it's absolutely fair to say we have seen just as much progress in the broader anti-corruption, counter-kleptocracy, even frankly anti-authoritarian space over the past few years, as much as anything we've seen in other periods of American history. And it's certainly possible that when this is all said and done, this chapter of American history, this will be the most successful single era that we have ever seen in terms of specific pieces of regulation, specific pieces of legislation, to say nothing of the rise in the awareness of the broader American body politic. And as you said, it's been a confluence of factors. It's the shifting geopolitical reality, the elevation of new malign threats out of places like Russia, China, and Iran. It is the revelation of things like data leaks, like the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, finally exposing how some of these transnational networks operate. And of course, it has been the bipartisan consensus that folks like Scott and his allies in Washington have been helping to build for years and years. You know, if you take any one of those away, we may not be where we are right now. But at the end of the day, we have to remind ourselves, and again, why I'm grateful to be having conversations like this with you today, that we have absolutely seen remarkable progress, and the momentum continues.
Yeah, anti-corruption and transparency efforts are really a weapon that democracies can use against rogue influence, against dictators. And this question about how we turn transparency from just being a shield for democracy into a sword is really important. And transparency, I think, is about the open and free flow of information, something that's very important for industry and trade, just as much as good governance. So, how do we, Casey, maybe this is a question for you. How do you think we should bring the private sector on board with the importance of this idea of radical transparency, transparency as a sword, similar to how we needed to do that or bring companies into compliance after the FCPA was passed, and of course that took a long time.
Well, I think the private sector is actually an ally, even if they haven't realized it yet in this fight. And I think the FCPA example is actually illuminating because, as you mentioned earlier in the conversation, Elaine, in the mid 1970s, the American private sector still viewed bribery, which outright bribery of foreign officials, it viewed it as business as usual. If I remember correctly, in other Western jurisdictions at the time, these kind of bribes of foreign officials could even be used as a tax write-off. I don't remember if that was the case in the United States in particular, but again, it was. Oh, so there we go. Right. So it was again very much seen as business as usual, and of course there was significant private sector opposition to the FCPA itself. But what ended up happening is once that legislation was passed, once it was on the books, the private sector in the United States of America realized that that was not just a shield for themselves, but a sword as well. That is to say, it was a potential element of appeal for foreign governments, foreign officials, and foreign polities and foreign jurisdictions that could now look at American companies and look at the American private sector and know that they were doing business above board. They were not helping entrench corrupt officials. They were not engaging in backroom, backhanded deals. And that made American commerce that much more appealing for foreign clientele, to say nothing of the domestic impact in the United States of America. Again, that's just one example of many that you can point to. Of course, at the end of the day, the private sector has to be one of the key partners in this fight, because without their support and so without their compliance with these laws and regulations, then these laws and regulations are not going to be worth the paper that they are written on. But I'm reminded as well, you know, we talked a moment ago about the initial burst in the early 2000s of anti-money laundering regulations in the American banking sector. And there was, to an extent, if you'd like to call it as such, a burden placed upon the American banking sector to comply with new anti-money laundering regulations, the setting up of compliance departments, the filing of suspicious activity reports, so on and so on. But of course, one of the impacts of this was taking a significant step toward cleaning out the tsunami of dirty money that had been flooding the American banking sector. But as we saw most recently, also turning the American banking sector into allies in the fight for further anti-money laundering reforms elsewhere, so that they did not have to shoulder the burden of anti-money laundering compliance themselves. If I remember correctly, the American Banking Association was one of the key allies in the passage of the Corporate Transparency Act itself, saying that this has been an effective piece of compliance that we have dealt with. Now it is time for the rest of the American private sector to follow suit as well. So again, it's about building these alliances, building this momentum to bring more and more elements of the private sector aboard, to bring these allies aboard, even if they don't quite realize they're allies just yet.
Let me add to that too. So, one of the maybe top 5 most important news developments on this issue set in the last 5 years or so happened last Friday when TD Bank, Canada's second largest bank, America's 9th largest bank, was publicly, revealed that they are paying a $3 billion settlement to the U.S. Treasury and Justice Departments because they failed to adequately comply with the Bank Secrecy Act. They did not have adequate anti-money laundering provisions in place. It essentially showed that they helped launder $670 million, $470 million from a single criminal network originating out of China, 3 different drug trafficking organizations with money going to Colombia, Mexico, China. I mean, it is, I think, by far the largest settlement that the US government has ever had with a bank or another financial institution in the United States. It is also the first time in history that a bank pled guilty to conspiring to launder money. The reason that we have the Bank Secrecy Act is so you have that additional level of control and oversight. It says to banks, you have to collect this information about your clients. You have to perform due diligence. You have to affirmatively make sure your clients are not using you to launder money. But this went way deeper than that. It said that these folks were essentially knowingly engaging in activity that had a high likelihood that they were laundering money for folks. That's the foundational money laundering law that we've had on the books for, all of time, essentially, in the United States. That's how far this bank went. And so when we talk about participation in the private sector, TD Bank disclosed in one of their quarterly filings that there was an investigation going on from the DOJ and the Treasury Department. It was sort of buried in their disclosure to investors that they have to do to the SEC. They have to say anything that's material, to their business structure and their potential profits and whatnot. But I'll tell you, when you have a $3 billion settlement, their stock took a tremendous hit. The confidence that investors have in this company's ability to turn them a profit, for customers of the bank to be able to rely on them. Casey is exactly right that through things like the FCPA and now FIPA, folks, especially international stakeholders, know that when they're doing business with American companies that are subject to these rules, and the rules worked in this case, that they can deal, on a fair playing field, and that there will be integrity and ethics baked into those relationships with American companies. That is going to make the investment community much more confident and steer their dollars toward American companies, as opposed to, say, any Chinese bank, which has never been hit with a violation of their correlative anti-money laundering laws. There has never been an FCPA case brought in China against a Chinese company, even though they have these laws on the books. I think it's pretty clear if you're a foreign investor where you'd want to put your money.
Scott, I should ask, the lack of prosecutions or investigations in China, is that because every single Chinese entity is operating above board and none of them are, for instance, bribing foreign politicians or engaged in money laundering?
That's exactly right. Yeah. I think it's funny that the same strategy that the US government can use to go after the financing of corrupt governments like China is much of the same strategy we used to go after organized crime back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I mean, they knew that we may not be able to catch them red-handed engaging in the criminal acts themselves, but if they were able to cut off the financing to those organizations, they could dry them up. It's the same story with large-scale criminal organizations like the CCP.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's no surprise that so many of these authoritarian, dictatorial, kleptocratic regimes do resemble organized crime, mafia of previous eras in how they operate and, of course, how they launder their money as well.
Winston Strawn is an international law firm that for more than 170 years has served as a trusted advisor and advocate for clients across virtually every industry. Winston & Strawn's law practice, made up of more than 950 attorneys across 15 global offices, is built on the talent, creativity, and determination of its lawyers and an unwavering commitment to its clients. Winston & Strawn boasts an exceptional financial crimes compliance practice comprised of attorneys who have decades of experience assisting clients with Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering compliance counseling, state and federal enforcement matters, and related investigations. Learn more about the firm's capabilities at winston.com. Hummingbird is a compliance platform that's reimagining what's possible from financial crime investigations. Teams using Hummingbird work more efficiently and effectively without compromising on quality. Investigators quickly get to the heart of each case with information at their fingertips and compliance-grade automation and AI to boost productivity. Designed for essential work in anti-money laundering, anti-fraud, customer due diligence, and more, Hummingbird allows you to customize the platform to your policies, giving you exactly what you need to get the job done. Hummingbird is determined to fight financial crime by empowering those on the front lines, because financial crime never stops evolving, and neither should the tools you use to stop it. Learn more at hummingbird.co. That's hummingbird.co. We just had a conversation with Ray Donovan on episode 2 of Coercive Capital, former special agent in charge at the DEA, and really the DEA's lead man on the fentanyl epidemic. And we talked a lot about the money laundering networks behind the fentanyl challenge. And these are very, very sophisticated organized criminal networks in China, also operating in the US, operating in Mexico, engaging with Mexican cartels, and using the North American banking system very effectively to launder the proceeds. And, that's also, I think, a thread going back to the TD case, and where we may see some interesting investigations and evidence of the connectivity between banks here in North America and what's happening in China. But I will say is it's been very difficult, I think, for the U.S. to get visibility into the Chinese banking system, for example, and certainly almost impossible to work together, right, to identify these rogue actors. Obviously, their incentives may be a little bit different than ours. So it's complicated, but it really, I think, brings the point across that we're living in a complex global financial system with lots of players using the system, and we have more ways and more tools where we could tighten it up, and certainly prosecuting those that are not doing what we need them to do is going to be a key part of that.
Yeah.
And Elaine, if I could just say, so there is a lot of understood frustration that the United States can't do more to leverage it and its allies' political will against state actors like China, who I think are knowingly, I think it's a part of state warcraft that they are allowing the financing of these opioid trafficking rings and networks to go through Mexico into the United States. I mean, that's a known criminal fact for their leadership there. But a lot of folks may be frustrated that we can't do more against China directly. But this is where something like the Enablers Act comes into play. There were American-based, American citizens who set up shell companies that allowed the Zhang opioid trafficking ring in the United States to distribute fentanyl and opioid synthetics across, I think, 36 different American states. There was a lawyer in Texas who used his law firm account to launder what he believed were drug trafficking proceeds. I mean, these are folks that are under the jurisdiction of American law and the DOJ. And if we give them the tools to go after our own vulnerabilities, our own, if you will, accomplices inside the United States, that's another significant way that we could take a piece of this out. And it doesn't require the foreign relations aspects that we do when we think about dealing bilaterally with China.
And again, as Scott just said, the financial secrecy architecture of those specific drug money laundering cases are identical to the broader array of more traditionally kleptocratic money laundering networks themselves, whether it is the shell company formation, the usage of lawyers and law firms, eventually the destinations of things like real estate or private investments or trusts or the art market, auction houses, the list goes on and on. These networks all rely on the opacity, the financial secrecy that has been provided and protected in spades by the United States of America and its allies for years and years. And as we know, increasingly every single day have been taken advantage of by whether it's the transnational drug networks or the transnational kleptocratic networks. This is all dirty money looking to be washed clean, and all too often happening right here in the United States of America.
Yeah, absolutely. Casey, I want to get to your new book in just a minute, but maybe one more question for Scott before we transition over to talking about foreign agents. Scott, what keeps you up at night when you think about the corruption challenge, where we need to go, all the efforts that are underway? What worries you the most?
I suppose this is a good segue into the topic that we're about to have, but I do worry that there is a decreasing resiliency and pushback amongst American elites in our political and economic systems to not fall sway to the short term results pull of authoritarian governments and authoritarian impulses inside the United States. I think it is often a path of least resistance for these folks to think I can bend or even break the rule of law or norms, sometimes, as we'll talk about, literally in service of other countries, but in order to achieve their own political ends, more quickly. And that, perhaps declining resiliency for us to assert the importance of the rule of law and the power of a system that is based on law and unbiased opinions that's what's most concerning to me, is that path has always been a threat for the United States, but there are signs here and there. Just to name it, most alarmingly, the conflicts over who won the 2020 election that we still have not been able to finish litigating. Once we start disagreeing about those bedrock principles of American democracy, boy, it opens the door to bending and breaking all sorts of understandings and rules that we have for how we govern ourselves. And I'm concerned that the short-term results and the very, discrete political benefits that people get from bending those rules is going to grow into something that we can't stop. So.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and this is why the foundation that we're talking about, building the structure, closing the loopholes, increasing the enforcement efforts, all of these things have to happen in tandem to reinforce the structures and make sure that we still have a foundation, right, for building on that. And it's going to become very difficult, I think, if we move away from these core principles around transparency. So, yeah, that's something I think we all need to keep our eyes on. Casey, I'd like to turn to you now to talk about the new book, Foreign Agents. For all our listeners who have not yet read the book, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. It's an entertaining read for a heavy topic. and I think it's a book that needed to be written. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah.
So maybe tell us a little bit about what compelled you to go down this pathway of writing this book, and what sorts of risks are we really talking about in the context of foreign agents that have influence in our political and even economic systems in the U.S.?
Sure. Thanks, Elaine, and thanks for the kind words about the book as well. Hopefully, there's a little bit of entertainment, maybe even fun, in a book about such a depressing, distressing topic. The book itself is an examination of the United States' foreign lobbying industry. This is predominantly the American firms and figures that act as lobbyists in Washington, D.C. and around the country on behalf of not other American constituents or American clients, but increasingly foreign governments, and especially foreign authoritarian regimes and even foreign dictatorships and their kleptocratic allies and oligarchic proxies. I wrote the book because this is an industry that is now worth billions of dollars. And as I argue in the book, is presenting increasing threats not only to democratic movements around the world, helping entrench anti-democratic and authoritarian regimes in country after country, but also is increasingly presenting a threat to America's democratic bedrock as well. It is an industry that has been in the news in recent years, far more than it had ever been previously. This is an industry that's been around for nearly a century at this point, but because of the rise of figures like Paul Manafort, who was Donald Trump's 2016 campaign manager, and a number of others in his inner circle, as well as a spate of recent prosecutions, including right here where I'm calling in from, New York City, where our dear mayor was recently indicted on what are, for all intents and purposes, foreign lobbying related charges. It is an industry that has been in the news far more recently than it has been previously, and I thought the time now was right to write a full-scale history, examination, and investigation of the book itself. It touches on the PR industry, the law firms, the consultancies, even the think tanks and the universities that are really undergirding the foreign lobbying sector in the 2020s in modern America. But Elaine, as you asked a moment ago, the kind of threat that this now poses, and this is what I wanted to build off of Scott's comments, these kind of, again, core bedrock principles of American democracy writ large. One of those being elected members of Congress or elected members of whatever legislative bodies are, according to basic democratic principles, supposed to be responsive to their constituents, whether it is in the state they represent, the municipality they represent, or of course in the executive branch, the country that they represent. But as we have seen in recent months, that is no longer the case in the United States of America. And to bring things into the foreign lobbying sector, we have now seen for the very first time in American history, in nearly 250 years, both the indictment and the conviction of a sitting member of Congress on foreign agents and foreign lobbying related charges. That was the recent conviction of Senator Bob Menendez from the great state of New Jersey, who, as a jury found, was no longer responding and responsive only to his constituents in New Jersey, but was conspiring to act as a foreign agent for the dictatorship in Egypt. He was accused of an array of crimes, secretly lobbying his colleagues, hiding gold bars and then Googling how much a gold bar is worth, and engaging in a number of other crimes that he never bothered to report to the Department of Justice, but of course was never supposed to be allowed to conduct in the first place as a sitting member of Congress. He was found guilty on these charges just a few months ago and has now since resigned his position. But I suppose what's most heinous about that example is that, again, he was not just some freshman legislator who didn't know what he was engaging in. He was the chairperson. He was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was the single most powerful senator as it pertains to creating and crafting American foreign policy. And he was and is now a convicted a foreign agent on behalf of a foreign government. And there's another case out of the House of Representatives as well that is ongoing. That is a gentleman named Henry Cuellar, who is indicted on acting as a foreign agent for the government of Azerbaijan. Again, unprecedented, uncharted waters of members of Congress completely abnegating, completely abandoning their basic core democratic principles of supposedly being representatives of their constituents, when in reality they are either accused or convicted of acting on behalf of foreign dictators.
So let me ask you this, Casey. Are we talking about an existential threat to democracy in America when we think about the foreign agent problem? Or is this a manageable problem? And if it's manageable, what can we do better? If it's existential, how should we be reordering government and alliances to address these threats?
You know, Elaine, if you'd asked me that question even a year ago, as I was finalizing the manuscript for the book, I would have said that this is perhaps not a manageable problem insofar as it will ever be fully tackled, but something that doesn't necessarily threaten the sanctity of American democracy or American elections or even American policymaking writ large itself. But given the conviction of a figure like Senator Bob Menendez, who again is the single most or was the single most powerful figure in American politics outside of the presidency and the executive branch in terms of crafting, American foreign policy and even American grand strategy itself. If a figure like that can be targeted, if a figure like that can be flipped, and if a figure like that can be secretly working at the behest of, again, not a treaty ally of the American government, not a democratic ally of the United States of America, but a military dictatorship who has any number of countervailing or opposed foreign policy principles to the United States of America, if they can flip a figure like the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, then as far as I can tell, any regime of that stature should feel confident they can flip any American legislator, at least outside of the executive branch itself. And that, as I would argue, does represent an existential threat to the United States of America, and at the very least, to American foreign policy writ large. Because if a figure like that like Bob Menendez can be bought by a government in Egypt, and again, we're not talking about the Russias or the Chinas who have even deeper pockets than the Egypts of the world. If a figure like that can be found out and convicted of secretly working on behalf of Egypt, then there is every reason to think that any other legislator can be bought and their price can be met as well. So in that sense, yes, I do increasingly view it as, without hopefully sounding too histrionic or too hyperbolic about it, an existential threat to American democracy writ large. Now, there are plenty of regulatory, legislative, prosecutorial decisions and priorities that can and absolutely should be pursued. Of course, on the one hand, simply prosecuting these cases, the fact that the Department of Justice under a Democratic administration was willing to go after a Democratic member of Congress is a wonderful testament to the sanctity of the American democratic experiment writ large. And the success of that case is absolutely a shot across the bow to other similar networks elsewhere. Enforcing things like the Foreign Agents Registration Act is absolutely a must, as well as increasing its the civil liability penalties as well, so they don't have to be convicted of crimes. They can get civil penalties, which are financial or civil injunctions, forcing the registration of some of these foreign lobbying networks. I mean, there are a whole array of potential fixes that would go a significant way toward clamping down at these networks. But again, I am increasingly of the opinion that time is running late. And the quicker we can get these legislative solutions, regulatory solutions in, the better off we will all be, both in the United States of America as well as around the world.
Scott, do you want to weigh in on this? Are we talking about an existential threat?
Well, first, I want to commend Casey and his publisher for their prescience in being able to predict what has to be the single most high-profile indictment in American history against a sitting politician in Mayor Eric Adams. On the back of the single highest, and Casey, I totally agree with you, most consequential indictment, prosecution, and conviction of a sitting member of Congress. I mean, this is just an incredible fact pattern. But to widen the lens a bit, I think the concern over this has been steadily building for the greater part of 2 decades. I remember in 2010, on the heels of the Citizens United decision, where the Supreme Court said that corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money in our elections because they are essentially people and so have the same First Amendment rights as people. Then President Barack Obama said in his State of the Union address that it had opened the door for foreign influence. This is famously when Justice Samuel Alito mouthed the words, "No, it doesn't," or "No, it didn't." But, President Obama was correct. This means that companies, even American subsidiaries that have significant foreign ownership, 5, 10, 15, 20%, held by foreign nationals, can spend as much money as they want influencing our elections. Something that is obviously illegal. If you're a foreign national, a citizen of another country, you can't spend a dime on elections, and yet you could create a subsidiary here. And, presumably you're spending money that is raised in the United States, and the foreign nationals don't have control about that. But all money is fungible in corporations. It's interchangeable if folks want to. And of course, they do spend money like that. I think in Seattle, for example, Amazon spent tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars, impacting their city council race, levels of foreign ownership in that company, which fluctuate every day. But from there, look at all the concern that we had over Russia's, spending of $100,000 on Facebook ads, which were not illegal at that time because while they referenced candidates by name, calling Hillary Clinton Satan, for example, it was outside those windows close enough to the election where American law regulates that. And because we don't have these kind of campaign finance transparency disclosure laws for Facebook ads, they were allowed to engage in this activity. Fast forward a couple years, and we see, the president's son, Hunter Biden, getting tens of thousands of dollars from a Ukrainian oil company, tens of thousands of dollars a month, with a skill set that he never developed and certainly didn't have to warrant that kind of payment. People perceived that as attempting to influence the White House. Now you've got these high-level indictments and convictions. The story is going on and on. I do agree that this is a much bigger problem. I think it's going to only become a bigger problem, but it is manageable to the sense that there's real bipartisan support for ways to address this, and we can get into that.
Yeah. I was going to say, just to jump on what Scott said a moment ago, of course, I do take full credit for all of the successes we have seen in this, but no, not at all.
I want to know who your mole is at the DOJ. Sometimes, that's who I want to know.
As famous American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, sometimes it's better to be lucky than to be good, and I can certainly attest to that. But no, I was going to say, just to that point, the money is fungible point. One thing I did want to flag that was still one of the most surprising, shocking, concerning elements of this broader foreign lobbying and foreign finance space is the fact that these American foreign lobbying firms, the PR shops, the law firms, increasingly the consultancies, and others, as well as the traditional lobbying shops, who represent foreign regimes, foreign governments, including many authoritarian regimes, and who directly lobby American officials themselves. There is no restriction whatsoever, aside from the basic donation caps themselves, for how much money they can pour into American elections and American campaigns. So if you just think about that for a moment, these are American lobbying firms that are taking money hand over fist from foreign governments, foreign regimes, and foreign oligarchs, and then can take that money and, of course, do whatever they would like with it, whether it's paying themselves, paying for media campaigns, so on and so forth, or taking that money and immediately directing it or redirecting it into financing American political campaigns themselves. Now, we don't have any evidence of specific contracts or specific emails where X regime or Y oligarch says, I'm sending you this money in order for you to give it to X candidate or Y candidate. They're a little bit generally wiser than simply putting it in writing. But again, I do think the financing structures speak for themselves, because sometimes we do see this money flowing even on the same exact day that either the donations or the meetings with these foreign officials, or the domestic officials are taking place. It is one example of many in which the scandal is not even necessarily what is illegal, but what is really legal at the end of the day.
And let me just make clear for folks, so it is illegal under federal law for a foreign citizen, a foreign national, to give money to a candidate for federal office, for state office, for even local office. It's one of the most bulletproof laws that we have. But as Casey says, if you work for a corporation, if you are a lobbyist and your clients who are paying your bills is a foreign government or foreign nationals, they're paying you a salary. And that money becomes fungible when it comes into your bank account for, whether your other sources of income or whatnot. And then you, as an American citizen, are obviously able to donate thousands of dollars to each and every federal candidate for office. It's the same thing with corporations here in the United States. They can and often do form corporate PACs where their employees get together, they pool the money that is often provided by their corporate salaries, and then they donate that directly to candidates or to PACs that support those candidates. It's also incredibly difficult for the public to know whether dark money groups, which have spent billions of dollars on American elections since being empowered by Citizens United, is coming from foreign sources, because the public never sees where those donations are coming from. It used to be the case that at least those dark money groups had to report it privately to the IRS. They don't even have that requirement anymore. So with all the mudslinging that we see a couple weeks ahead of the election, the American public simply does not know.
Yeah, and I think if they did know, they'd be horrified. That's why we have to keep talking about these issues and making the connections between, the gaps, our legislation, Supreme Court decisions, the real impacts, that are felt, sort of all throughout the system. But it's not just the U.S. I think a lot of other countries face similar issues. I'd love to ask you both, maybe Casey, starting with you. Are there novel or effective means of addressing some of these risks, particularly around foreign agents and the inflow of funds through those agents that we should be thinking about? I mean, an international gold standard out there that you came across when you were doing research on your book, and how should democracies be learning from each other?
Well, interestingly, in the foreign lobbying space, it is the United States of America. That is the gold standard, and it has been the gold standard since 1938, when the Foreign Agents Registration Act was first passed. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, similar to the FCPA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act was on the books for decades, but was effectively forgotten. It was very much a backwater. No one at DOJ, no one in the broader American body politic paid any attention to it whatsoever, and it's only in recent years that it's seen this kind of resurge to importance. But in that resurge, it's also return to the stature of being a model that it has always been, and that other countries, and especially other democratic allies, can now look to. I mean, at a very basic level, the Foreign Agents Registration Act does not make any foreign lobbying illegal. It does not ban any lobbying from Americans on the ground who want to speak on behalf of and represent foreign governments and foreign regimes themselves and foreign nationals themselves that, of course, get paid in the process. It simply requires the transparency for them to disclose what they are doing and who they are doing it for and how much money they are making along the way. And then the American Department of Justice will disclose that information to the rest of us. This is the gold standard. This is the transparency model that other democratic allies are now looking to as they begin implementing their own versions of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And they are starting down this path. In Australia, a few years ago, they implemented their first version of it. We have seen discussions ongoing in places like Canada. The United Kingdom is going to be implementing its foreign influence registration scheme that should be coming online supposedly later this year. It might be next year at this point. The EU, as it is unfortunately want to do, has been dragging its feet, but they're at least nominally moving in the right direction. But again, Elaine, this gets to what you mentioned at the end of your question, and how and why democracies can and should learn from one another. They have to learn from one another, because at the end of the day, this is the only way we are ever going to succeed in pushing back against this authoritarian tide that has been creeping ever closer to our shores, and in many ways is now inside our borders itself. Learning from the successes, learning from the failures, learning from the struggles and the challenges of one another is the only way democracies around the world, including America's democratic allies, are ever going to begin restoring and reshoring their democratic credentials and shining light on these foreign influence, foreign lobbying schemes, and writ large, these foreign financing schemes themselves. Scott can speak more to the kind of successes and the lessons learned in the financial transparency side of things in terms of transnational criminal networks, transnational kleptocracy. But that is the only way we're ever going to succeed. We do not operate, we do not live in a vacuum. We have to look to our partners, look to our allies for what successes, what challenges they have seen in order to get our own country in order as well.
Scott, did you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, the good news is there has been a lot of activity at the state level on this too. So Minnesota became the first state, I think just last year, that banned foreign influenced corporations. So corporations that do have that amount of appreciable foreign ownership from being able to spend money on elections in their state. This was modeled after a city level ordinance that passed in St. Petersburg that I worked on about 10 years ago. Seattle passed one shortly after. California has, someone famously passed a ban on foreign companies or foreign nationals spending on their ballot propositions after, I believe, a Dutch company spent $300,000 influencing a proposal in Los Angeles. That tide is definitely increasing, which I think is good. Casey mentioned FARA does not censor foreign voices from being able to influence, the political discussion and lobbying here in the United States. I think it could. There are certainly a lot of other countries that have taken that for national security, other reasons. We could strictly say, and there has been some legislation in Congress, look, if you're a foreign company or a foreign entity, you have to go through diplomatic or trade channels. You can't seek to, influence American elections and lobby in between those elections. You have to be more overt. I think the US has so far chosen the right path, but as Casey says, we don't have a lot of models around the world to look to. We actually engaged a law firm for our anti-corruption policy lab to look around the world for other examples of countries that have any real limitations on especially high-level political officials being able to leave their positions of office and then go lobby on behalf of a foreign country, and we couldn't find a single one. And unfortunately, in many countries, lobbying in and of itself is illegal. So one reform that I would point to, which has been really promising, is that about 2 years ago, a bipartisan proposal known as the Cardin-Risch rule was enacted. And it basically says if you are the secretary or the undersecretary of the State Department here, you can never lobby on behalf of any foreign government after you leave that position. It also says if you're a Senate confirmed person in the State Department, so think every ambassador, the folks who head up the different divisions and subsects of the State Department, you have a 3-year, what's known as a cooling off period before you could do the same. And when it comes to about half a dozen high-risk countries, think China, Russia, Iran, Syria, you can never do that. It's a great start. Bipartisan, folks understood the risks presented by these folks who are, obviously working in all parts of the world where they may be subject to these temptations. We need to harmonize it across the entire federal government. We need to make that the standard for every department, bureau, agency, so that leadership and positions of high influence and risk cannot be manipulated by foreign powers.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's it's kind of a no-brainer that we should be putting these sort of prohibitions in place. Make that distinction that there's a limitation around where public servants should take their expertise post-government. And so interesting to learn that there really is no gold standard outside of the US. We know we have some challenges with our standards, but I love the idea that we could really put all of this work on steroids and look to some new multilateral engagement to really try to take a bite out of these problems together with our core allies. Because, it really occurred to me the other day as I was thinking about this podcast and how to approach these issues that, we spend so much money protecting our democracy. You think about the investments we make in defense, the investments we make in protecting our economy and strengthening our economy, trying to help our companies do well. It's all taxpayer money to strengthen the U.S. and work with our allies and keep the open rules-based system in place and keep our country safe. And at the same time, the front door is absolutely open to influence. And for a relatively small amount of money, our core values have been compromised. So we need to close that door, and we need to close it more generally, I think, for democracies. And this is also, I think, an important part of this concept that I've written about extensively around ally shoring, which is about protecting critical supply chains and working on economic integration with allies and partners. But really, none of that will work without the democratic framework around that structure, and having transparent, open, rule of law based approaches is what makes all this work. It's what brings foreign direct investment into countries and keeps it there. It's what will drive a democratic framework and a strong economic system. So I think there's a lot that we can do and a lot more threads to pull on this conversation. Maybe I'll ask you one final question to close out our discussion today, which has been amazing. And that is for the next administration, which will come in just in the next few months. What are the one or two most important things that need to get done on the anti-corruption agenda? Scott, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, so I can think of 4. So one, we mentioned the Corporate Transparency Act that is actively being implemented and stood up right now by the Treasury Department. Most of the companies that will have to report their beneficial owners have until January 1st, 2025 to do so. We've got to make sure that that deadline is kept. and that those companies that fail to, report their information, where they willfully fail to do what they know they're supposed to and they don't, that the law is enforced against them to ensure a culture of compliance. Second, we mentioned the Enablers Act. We have got to give the Treasury Department the authority to crack down on the lawyers, the accountants, the corporate service providers, et cetera, who are blindly being exploited, and the servicemen and the bag carriers for these corrupt and other criminal regimes around the world. Third, we've got to get greater funding for our financial cops on the beat. That's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, the folks who are enforcing both of these rules. We've got to get greater assets to our Kleptocrats task force in the United States that has been going after Russian assets that are the product of corruption and other illicit finance here. And finally, I think we've really got to make sure that when it comes to protecting our own democracy at home and being that shining light for the rest of the world, that we pass domestic reforms like the Freedom to Vote Act, which would shine a light on dark money in the United States, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, to make sure that we are affirming and protecting voting rights within our own country. Those are the two proposals that have been listed by name by Kamala Harris on the campaign trail. But these are things that can and should be adopted by any future administration. I'll add one more piece. When the next administration comes in, no matter which candidate it is, on day one, they can address this foreign lobbying issue by requiring all of their employees to agree to an ethics pledge that says, on your way out the door, you will not lobby, aid, or consult any foreign government. Become a lobbyist or a consultant for them at any point after your career. The Trump administration had this on the books. Unfortunately, it was waived the day that President Trump left office. The Biden administration has an even broader proposal on this. We have to make sure that that standard, that precedent becomes a strong norm and a resilient norm for the next and future administrations.
Yeah, I'll just echo everything Scott said. And if folks want to take a closer look into some of the legislative and regulatory fixes, I cannot recommend enough going over to Transparency International U.S. chapter's website or contacting Scott directly to ask for more information on any of these fixes, which are absolutely, each and every one of them, worth pursuing. Again, I don't know that I have necessarily much to add in addition to that, other than to say it is about especially the enforcement of the laws, of the regulations that we already have on the books themselves. Again, I've mentioned it a few times throughout this, whether it was with things like the Foreign Agents Registration Act or even the FCPA itself, to say nothing of some of the other loopholes that we've talked about already today. You can have as many pieces of legislation, as many regulatory fixes on the books as you want, but if they are not being forced, if folks on the investigative and the prosecutorial side are not being funded, and if there is not an overall emphasis on that kind of enforcement itself, then those laws and those regulations will not be worth the paper that they are written on. They have to be enforced. They have to be funded so that they can live up to the potential that they have set, not only here in the United States of America, but again, if we are to act as the example, as the gold star for other democratic allies elsewhere, they have to be enforced and funded so that other democratic partners can also learn from and add to these successes themselves. And of course, as I think Scott mentioned a moment ago, to turn things back to my first book, which looked at the United States of America's role as a center of transnational illicit finance and international money laundering. For the next administration, I would love to see the continuation of the rulemaking process for the real estate sector and for the private investment sector, because those are two key pillars that do remain, in addition to the shell company industry, which we've already seen successes in. If we can tackle the real estate sector and the private investment sector, then we will have gone far further than I ever imagined in finally closing the door to the United States of America as an offshore and money laundering haven. I would love to see that finally happen.
Combating corruption and its weaponization by rogue regimes must be a permanent part of U.S. national security policy. We spend billions on defending our country, putting our military personnel in harm's way, and shoring up our allies' defenses. And at the same time, we leave the front door open to rogue influence at home and the weakening of democracies abroad. I want to thank Scott and Casey for an insightful conversation. We'll be discussing much more about corruption, foreign policy, and the case for radical transparency in future episodes. I'm Elaine Dezensky. This is Coercive Capital. on the Illicit Edge Network.